Welcome everybody to CSIRO's first webinar for 2021. We thought we were going to get a few more off the ground before this one, but it's proven to be a very busy year. So thanks for bearing with us. Turns out you've all been looking forward to it apparently, because we've got one of the biggest audiences we've seen yet, and I'm very grateful for that. And I think part of that probably comes down to the topic we've chosen, looking at free running mode versus passive house design. It's a topic that it raises very hot passions amongst some people, and I've noticed there's already been some conversation on Twitter and LinkedIn and some strong opinions being voiced. So I'm very grateful to have our presenters here to offer their views of the different options available. Before we start though, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd like to also pay respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. Particularly in this NAIDOC week, it's good to make that acknowledgement. I sit somewhere between Naarm and a place where the Mullumm and Yarra meet, and there's a homestead there called the Pontville Homestead that was built by a guy called Charles Norman in 1844. After, according to him, clearing all of the houses of the Aboriginal people who lived there. And he built gun slot windows basically in that house to keep those Indigenous traditional owners away from the place. So as I look up the Yarra Valley, it's kind of, it's very immediate, that history. And so it's worth making that acknowledgement. And I'm pleased that I hope that there are some Indigenous people in the audience today, and extend my respect to them as well this week. We've got 4 speakers today, and as I said, they are all people very passionate about passive house design or passive solar design. And for those of you that don't know the difference potentially in the audience, you're about to get an education, I think, because this is one of the big dualities in sustainable design at the moment. CSIRO occupies an interesting place in this regard. We build tools for the national regulatory system, but we don't always set settings that go there. And in occupying that role, we have an interesting kind of tension there between what's going to work for delivering the policy outcomes. How do we actually get really low energy buildings in Australia's very, very wide variety of climates? And how do we prevent the kind of problems of mold and condensation, poor indoor environment quality? And I think both free running buildings, passive solar design, and passive house buildings offer options to do that, but they are coming from very, very different perspectives. So to talk you through it, we'll first have Clarke from Clima. We're then going to move to Peter Hickson from the Earth Building Association. Kylie Mills from the board of the Australian Passive House Association will follow up. And lastly, we'll have a video from Phil Harris at Troppo Architecture. Sadly, Phil has had a personal issue arise and kindly offered to record a session for us. So Phil will be presenting by video today. At the end of the presentations, there'll be the chance to have all of your questions asked by our expert panel. There are 2 sessions on the right, 2 sidebars on the right of your screen. One is a chat and one is a Q&A session. Please use the chat to chat amongst yourselves, to share links and interesting thoughts and whatever else. But that will not come through to the speakers, so we won't be seeing that as we're speaking. If you'd like to ask us a question, please put it in the Q&A box, and that will come through to a speaker queue, and I will ask those questions of the speakers at the end of the 4 sessions. We are recording all of this, so please don't let your passions get out of hand in the chat. Keep it nice. I think that's about it, except to say that there's support in the chat function and in the Q&A function. You'll see a participant called VBrick. That's our very own Eric from CSIRO, who's hovering about to help us all out. And Lachlan Cheers will be in there too. I'm not entirely sure of his name. I think he just appears as Lachlan, but he should be there to help you as well. So without going on and on, oh, actually, I am going to go on and on about it. One more thing. CSIRO's conference, the Australian Residential Energy Rating Conference, is looking like it's back on the 23rd and the 24th of November. We're going to start communicating about that more widely very soon, and you should see communications coming out. If you are not signed up to our website, you can go to our Australian Housing Data Portal, ahd.csiro.au, and click on subscribe down the bottom, and you'll get updates about that conference. It'll be held in Sydney, and it will be held come hell or high water no matter what happens with COVID. We have plans to make it all online if needs be, or anything from hybrid to fully in person along the way. So please register, and we'd love to see you there. So I really will stop talking now and hand over to our first speaker. Jesse has been at these before. He needs no further introduction. I'll just ask him to share his slides and kickstart the discussion. Thanks, Jesse. Jesse, you're muted, I'm afraid.
There we go. Sorry, start again.
No problem.
So thanks for the introduction, Anthony. My name's Jesse Clarke, as Anthony said. I'm from Clima, and I'm going to be presenting about engineering energy efficiency, not just engineering the building, but engineering the system to deliver energy efficiency. Seal it tight and ventilate right. And we're going to be how we actually deliver efficiency without sacrifice. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the question, why do we regulate? And the main purpose of building codes are to protect public health, safety, and general welfare as they relate to the construction and occupancy of buildings and structures. And I picked this definition because I like it, because it calls out those two specific requirements of health and safety. So keeping that in mind, the building code sits there and we regulate the safety and health and safety of buildings. Under safety, we obviously have to make our buildings stand up. Structural is the most important thing we have to make our buildings do. And then we have the fire requirements stemming from big events like the Great Fire of London and when half of London burnt down. So we need to make sure we don't spread fire and we keep life safety at the forefront. Then we go to health, and there's different things that make up health in the building code, but in particular things like waterproofing or weatherproofing, thermal comfort, and acoustics. So thermal comfort is actually a subset of health, keeping ourselves comfortable. It's not a luxury, it's a matter of course, and we have to actually be healthy. So how do we do that? If we have a really poorly designed building, we throw energy at it to keep ourselves comfortable. We use heating and cooling systems. So then that potentially leads to a perverse outcome, an unintended consequence of high energy use. So we have to design our buildings, insulate them, make them better, the building fabric better to retain that energy. When we start doing that and we do that well, we start to figure out that we have an unintended consequence of the unintended consequence, which is moisture. And that moisture is by the occupants, coming from the occupants' internal moisture or from external weatherproofing that leaks into our construction systems. Both those moisture things make up part of the health discussion, as well as keeping the building thermally stable, thermally comfortable, so that we don't stress ourselves. So the big issues that are affecting residential energy efficiency are exacerbated summer cooling. So using too much cooling in the summer, more than we expect, according to the calculations. Peak electrical loads, so we accidentally create these afternoon peak spikes when everyone turns on the air conditioners to cool down their buildings. And we've got the health side with thermal stability, making sure that we actually keep our buildings within a healthy, comfortable range. We've got the perverse outcome of moisture coming out of the effects of insulating our buildings and not really insulating them in the right manner, and understanding the effects of that thermal control on the moisture balance of the construction systems. And then, as Anthony alluded to, indoor air quality and what happens and how do we keep the air fresh inside by maintaining healthy indoor conditions and adequate airflow in our buildings. So where we are now, 6 stars, generally speaking, across the country. 2022, we're looking at moving to 7 stars. The question is, are we ready? Are we ready to take that on, to move to more insulation, understanding all these unintended consequences that might happen? And in doing that, I'm going to talk more about that in my presentation and where we need to go in terms of managing all those risks. So there's different ways we can address these issues, but the fundamental question of how do we achieve comfort, not comfort, health? How do we achieve health? Because comfort is just a subset of health. So traditionally, in the old days, on the left, would keep warm using heat sources, would have a building that was basically designed very much like a cave-like structure, a lot of mass. So because that mass would help us keep cool in summer. We didn't have air conditioners in that day and age. So then we needed the sun in winter, and we needed timber, wood burning to keep ourselves warm. We moved on from that. Where we are now is we provide more comfort, but let's not talk about comfort, let's talk about health. We provide more thermal health by using systems that are bolted on to our building fabric. We've got a mediocre sort of building fabric, and then we add on heating and cooling systems, we add on PV, batteries, whatever else to try and offset the energy use of those systems. The more elegant way of doing it is to move to a system where we provide more health using an extremely well-designed building envelope, and then we just have minimal add-on systems to keep ourselves thermally comfortable. So reducing the amount of systems that we need to do that. What I'd like to draw attention to is the penetration of air conditioners by state. So this report from the Australian Energy Market Operator in 2019, it looks at the amount of air conditioners across new and existing buildings in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, and that ranges from about 65% of air conditioners up to over 80% of air conditioners in Victoria. But this, when we look at this, we've got two options. We either ban air conditioning altogether and go back to using the building fabric itself to keep ourselves cool and warm using the sun, or we accept that we have air conditioners and people like air conditioners and they like to stay comfortable, and we need to design our buildings to retain that energy and use it in the best possible way we can use the systems to keep ourselves comfortable and healthy. So then the option comes down to we're using a mediocre building envelope with a lot of systems plugged in and bolted on to try and make it work, or we're using the elegant solution where we have a very well built and designed building envelope and minimal amount of bolted on systems. Again, I'd like to draw your attention to this report, which is cold hard facts number 3. And a cold hard fact that you need to know is that in many Australian houses in 2016, there may be several reverse cycle wall hung split AC systems that provide both heating and cooling. This report also goes on to say new homes and apartments built in the last 2 decades almost always have at least one wall hung split system as a standard inclusion. So basically 100% of new builds are having air conditioning and reverse cycle air conditioning at that. So they've got heating and or cooling. So the other question we've got is, where do we actually build? And this is a heat map of the NatHERS zones based on housing approval data from 2017 and 18, and split down into the NatHERS zones. You can see those red hotspots are where all the housing development's happening. So it's happening in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne. Okay, nothing new, we should know that. Some bits of development happening in Adelaide, Perth, other capital cities. And then we've got spread up the Queensland coastline, a little bit of development happening in relation to those other areas. The question that we need to ask is, what would Jim and Mark say about this air conditioning heating debate? So for those of you who don't know who these two gentlemen are, Jim Masterton from Masterton Homes and Mark Simmons from Simmons Homes. And basically what they deliver to the market is buildings that will always have heating and cooling. Is that because they want to? I don't know, but it's because the market demands it, the market wants it. So they're delivering these buildings with heating or cooling, and a lot of these homes. So the question is, have we lost the battle against these heating and cooling systems? Can we get rid of them and just build the old way? Well, I don't think we've lost the battle. I think what we need to do is we basically need to build our buildings so that we can, well, we accept that we've got these heating and cooling systems and build the buildings to retain the energy and use that energy in the most efficient way possible. So where we are is this, the mediocre building envelope with all these bolt-on systems. We've got this whole of house thing being developed in the background by CSIRO and the NatHERS team, which is essentially that. It's a mediocre building envelope with a whole bunch of stuff tacked onto it. So where do we go from there? Do we go back in time? We ban air conditioning, ban heating systems, and we provide less comfort with less energy. Simple equation, less comfort, less energy, less carbon emissions. Or we go the other way and we provide more comfort, or sorry, more health for less energy. That's a much harder equation, but that's if we're going to go forward where we need to go. So in the past, well, sorry, I'm an engineer, scientist. I like mathematics, so I like to look at things in limits as we approach zero, limits as we approach infinity, and the truth probably lies somewhere in between. So if we take the R value of a structure as the limit approaches zero, so 40 years ago when we lived in houses with no insulation, what do we need to keep ourselves comfortable? We need to make up for that poor performing building envelope with lots of heat. Heat from the sun, heat from fire, heat from anywhere we can get it. If we go the other way and we go to limit of the R value approaches infinity, so whatever insulation level you're thinking of, double it, then you get a different equation. And the equation is essentially we don't need the sun to keep ourselves warm anymore. We actually don't want the sun, and to keep ourselves cool, that insulation also works. So turning the page and having a look at that, what about this overheating thing? What happens when we've got sun coming into our building? What happens when we have this super insulated, well-built building envelope? If you do this, yes, you'll end up potentially with a perverse outcome and creating excessive amount of cooling load. But when we do this super insulated structure, we don't need the sun to make up for deficiencies in our construction quality. The construction quality is so good that the insulation itself, the insulation system, keeps the heat out, and we don't want to introduce that sun into our buildings. Unless you invite it, or if you invite it through poorly designed windows, that's when you end up with big problems occurring. So if we don't need the sun to keep our buildings warm in winter, and we can keep our buildings cool through blocking out the sun, then we have independence from orientation. So when we do housing developments, it doesn't matter which way we orientate that housing development, which way the houses are oriented, all we need to do is make sure that we block out the sun so that we don't overheat our buildings. So this issue was raised back in 2013 in a CSIRO report, and this evaluation of the 5-star energy efficiency standard for residential buildings highlighted it. It said up front somewhere, the average cooling energy use in summer was greater in higher rated houses in Brisbane and Melbourne. However, it is not clear whether this was due to behavioural factors, and one of them is the extent of windows and opening and closing during the summer. So the NatHERS system assumes people are running around opening and closing windows. So we have 10-star occupants in the house doing this for us. In advanced economies like California, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories found, they went out and did a study on how often people open and close windows. They found some of the reasons people don't open and close their windows is the fact that no one's home, or they might want to keep the rain out. If it looks like it's going to rain that day, they don't open their windows. So there's various reasons why you might not open your windows. And I want to play this video for you, so hopefully this comes through, but this is Max Sherman from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory speaking in a ventilation forum at the University of New South Wales in 2018.
Yeah, let me add on to that a little bit. People do adapt. They adapt by doing all sorts of things. Adaptation is a very bad thing. Adaptation is putting stress on people. They're making them do things they wouldn't otherwise do. We had exactly the same problem in the US when we first did these sorts of things. People took back savings in efficiency in terms of improving their indoor environment because it made them healthier, happier, more comfortable. Unless you value health, comfort, safety of people, then you're going to get the wrong answer because you're going to say, oh, it's only about energy efficiency. Well, first you have to have a good indoor environment before you worry about efficiency. And that's what you have to do by improving the housing stock so that people are healthier. You give them something that's actually in the comfort range, not something that they can live in for a while. People die in heat waves because their ability to adapt has stressed them so far that they no longer can do it. And if you start them off in a more fragile environment by stressing them all the time with a little bit of overheating, it's just going to be worse. So that you have to, but that has to be built into the policies. Health has to be there first before you get to energy savings. Yeah, let me.
So basically taking these international learnings and applying them in the Australian context, the ERA Special Technical Group for Building Physics, or Australian Institute of Refrigeration and Heating, developed a project around high performance housing. This was a duplex in Wollongong, looked at all the key features that make up a well-designed, building, including highly insulated building envelope, thermal bridging, which you're looking at those circles. So the key areas where you might get excessive amounts of energy leakage out of your building, looking at airtight building envelope, looking at high performance windows, and looking at ventilation systems to maintain indoor air quality and healthy conditions, as well as purge heat out of the building in summer. So I just want to take a deep dive into this, and this is where it starts getting techie, because I want to ask the question, what does Chenath tell us about this building methodology? So Chenath engine is the engine used in the NatHERS tools, used in all the software tools to calculate star ratings. If we take that duplex and we look at that under a NatHERS and normal assumptions with a high performing building envelope, well insulated, well performing glass or good performing glass, and the air infiltration is based on the NatHERS assumptions. There is no validation of the construction quality in NatHERS. There's no blower door test required. There's no post-construction validation required. So you don't actually know what you get at the end of the day, but that's a different story. So NatHERS 8.6 star is what that would achieve. If I go a step further and take, well, okay, let's seal this building tight and let's ventilate it right. So we up the insulation a little bit. We down the air tightness, or make the air tightness better to international best practice, 0.6 air changes at 50 pascals. And we put on the best performing windows we can find in terms of U value and low solar heat gain coefficient. So this is the building. This is the floor plans duplex. We're going to look at the eastern duplex, the top one there, and we're going to look at the star ratings of that. So it's a 2-story duplex. The bedrooms are on the upper level at the front of the house. So when you look at the heating and cooling loads in that simulation of that duplex, you get around 2.5, 3 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year for heating and cooling. That's an 8.6 star rating. If we close all the windows on that building and rerun the simulation, you drive up the cooling load 300–400%. So if the occupants aren't a 10-star occupants, but they're 0-star occupants and couldn't be bothered opening their windows or just don't know how to operate their building, that's potentially what happens. And then the star rating will drop to around 6.8 stars. The truth lies somewhere between. People will open their windows, but maybe not like a 10-star occupant like we want them to. The next step is then, well, what happens when we super insulate that structure? We take into consideration air tightness, we take into consideration thermal bridging, we use mechanical systems to keep the indoor air healthy, but also to purge heat out in summer. Then we get an outcome that looks more like the last scenario. And that will then bring the star rating back up to 8.2 stars. So what we've got is a scenario in the NatHERS system, or the assumptions in the NatHERS system, that's just assuming this ideal world, these ideal occupants, 10-star occupants that are operating their buildings. In reality, we may have the second case and the cooling load driving up massively. The truth probably lies somewhere between them, but in the third case, we can actually control that and actually deliver outcomes because we're using controlled systems to do it. The other issue we've got emerging is moisture, as Anthony pointed out in the introduction. And moisture issues in construction in Australia is not limited to just the cooler states of Australia. It extends all the way up to the tropics and going up to Mackay and Cairns, and actually in the tropics where there's more moisture in the air, outside air, then it's actually potentially a worse scenario in terms of mold growth. So everywhere across Australia, we're ending up with moisture-related problems. So why is this? Well, in the past, we had buildings that were super air leaky. The buildings were air leaky, they had huge gaps, the windows would have 20 millimeter gaps around them, the air and the energy would just go straight through that. The air didn't have time to condense anywhere, it would go straight out, and you'd be generally harmless from a moisture perspective, but from an energy perspective, you won't be getting what you paid for, essentially. If we start to build semi-airtight structures, then we create more tortuous, more convoluted pathways through the construction systems. This gives the moisture-laden air from inside the building in the heating season more time to condense on the cooler surfaces on the outside of the building. And that's when you end up with big condensation problems happening. And this is probably where we're sitting now, but we don't really know because we don't air pressure test enough buildings to know how air leaky or how airtight they actually are. The solution to both these problems is simply build it tight. build it very tight and as tight as you can build it. That stops the moisture from going into the construction system to places where you don't want it to go. And this is how you build healthy buildings. No worries. So then I want to look at health and zoning, how we zone up the buildings, or what we assume to zone our buildings in the NatHERS system is we have day zones, we have night zones. But when you do this, you create humidity in the occupied zones, and in the colder zones, that's where all the moisture will be attracted to. The coldest walls in the house is where the moisture is going to then be attracted to and create high humidity and then potential long-term mold growth. So if we start to think about the buildings as a single holistic ecosystem, one zone, then we get a different outcome. We condition the whole building. We keep it all warm, we keep it all cool, depending on what climate you're in. And we have the building fabric designed not just with insulation, but with exterior weather barriers and with internal air barriers and vapor control layers. And these can be tuned for whatever climate the building is being built in to get the optimal solution in terms of protection from damp and mold related issues. So taking this into consideration, the NatHERS zonal model makes certain assumptions around how you heat and cool buildings, how the day-night zones are working. If we then say, well, okay, let's just continuously heat and cool this building 24 hours, 7 days a week at 20 to 25 degrees Celsius, what we get in the base model is we drive up the heating. So we're using more heating, but there's a reason we're using more heating, because we don't want to have cold zones at night. Because if we get cold zones at night, that's where we get the mold growth. So it's for health that we're using more heating energy. Then you move to the second case, which when you close all the windows, you drive up the cooling load again. But what you do notice is in the continuously running air conditioned model, you don't get the same amount of cooling load as in the zonal model. This is because you're not creating the hot box effect and then having to use the air conditioning systems to draw down the temperature from 35 or 40 degrees in a certain zone within the house when you want to maintain comfort. Then taking it a step further and you go to the super insulated airtight system with heat recovery ventilation and purge ventilation, which might be a summer bypass mode on the heat recovery ventilator, or it could be a dedicated purge ventilator. You get an outcome that delivers a certain heating and cooling load, but that heating and cooling load is going to actually deliver health, and it's going to be predictable in nature. And what we don't want to do is create this massive cooling spike or accidental cooling spike. So the controlled ventilation systems can help us manage that, as well as the indoor air quality. Lastly, I want to talk about peak load. So peak load, there's an excellent article online on LinkedIn from the Passive House California about this, but basically duct curve, which is the head of the duct in the afternoon, where you create a big peak load spike in the afternoon, and in the morning when everyone wakes up, you end up with these two potential peak load spikes. But when you look at those same models I just showed you, if you run the air conditioning 24 hours, 7 days a week, you get a much lower peak load on the air conditioning. And this is what we're after. So we don't create that hotbox effects where we have to then get home from work, turn on the air conditioner and bring that energy, or use excessive amounts of energy to bring the temperature back down to where we want it. So lastly, health is not everything, but without health, everything is nothing. I just want you to think about that. And if you want more information, hot off the press, we've got the ProClima Blue Book. This is over 100 different construction systems, some of which are very good in managing moisture, and I would encourage you to download it and have a look. And then you can sign up to our newsletter as well on our ProClima website. And we also have a whole bunch of training going on that is constantly updated on our website as well, if you want to have a look at that. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Jesse. Make sure you get your questions in the Q&A for Jesse. I see them coming through. I will relay them to him.
After 40 years researching, learning, and developing skills in sustainable design and construction, I realised there is a solution that works anywhere and everywhere, and it always has. We're still learning, experimenting, and improving, though I'm recommending a solution that is best described as passive low-energy earth architecture. That is PLEEA or PLE. To contextualise this debate, we need to consider the bigger picture. We need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by as much as possible and as quickly as possible. We need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and transition to renewable economies by 2050. If we wish to be world leaders, we need solutions that are equitable and accessible to anyone, anywhere on this planet. It's not a pretty sight, one we're becoming more familiar with, unfortunately. In Australia, our buildings need to be resilient in warming climates, able to cope with more unpredictable and unsettled weather patterns, more pronounced and frequent storms, droughts, floods, bushfires, cold snaps, and heat waves. If I were to describe the essence of passive low energy earth architecture with 5 lines, they would be: 1, unfired earth and natural materials; 2, appropriate climate responsive design; 3, natural ventilation and natural conditioning; 4, adaptive comfort, safety, health and resilience; and 5, renewable technology for full life cycle design, zero carbon performance. Earth building is appropriate, renewable and sustainable technology. Unfired earth is the essential element that often provides the internal and external walls, though sometimes the floor and the roof. It offers a strong and durable structure and thermal mass with the lowest possible embodied energy. Earth provides excellent hygrothermal properties for balancing and controlling humidity. Earth is non-combustible and complies with the highest bushfire attack level rating flame zone. It also has a fire rating of up to 4 hours and allows a barrier to sound and electromagnetic radiation. Earth elements provide the fabric energy storage necessary for thermal stability, allowing maximum natural gains and balanced, predictable, acceptable adaptive comfort, ease of operation, a thermal refuge, health and safety, and the benefit of stillness and quiet. The earth elements can be optimized for climate by varying density and thickness, which adjusts thermal characteristics. Generally, lower densities are suited to colder climates and higher densities to hotter climates, and thickness increases thermal lag and storage capacity. Insulation needs to be appropriate to climate. By climate, I mean external conditions, including maximum and minimum external temperatures, the seasonal temperature differentials between inside and outside, including diurnal fluctuation and solar gain potential. Climate determines whether bulk, reflective, or dynamic optimized mass insulation is required and where it is necessary and beneficial. Sometimes it's inevitable we need to use steel, glass, cement, and other manufactured materials. Hopefully their embodied energy is being slowly reduced, though the use of earth and other natural materials like stone, timber, and fibres, recycled materials, keeps embodied energy as low as possible. Materials sourced as locally as possible are best. Ideally, the earth material is from the building's own footprint. Appropriate climate responsive design means 2 things. Firstly, there is no one passive design solution that fits all climates. Secondly, buildings should respond to a particular climate, encouraging, allowing and maximising natural gains such as cool of night and cooling breezes and warmth of day. Through design, a building should achieve as much adaptive comfort as possible from freely available external conditions. Appropriate climate responsive design encompasses passive solar design used in temperate climates, as well as passive design principles used in tropical, Mediterranean, inland, desert, highland, and even alpine climates. Natural ventilation keeps buildings healthy and safe. They're still simple and affordable to build, maintain, and economical to operate. Through mass-linked ventilation, there is a constant balancing of temperature and humidity. There is a constant 2-way energy and humidity exchange between the earth elements and fresh air changes. This is best described as natural conditioning. This natural conditioning often negates the need for air conditioning, or at least minimises its use or time shift demand to when the sun shines. Indoor air quality is assured, condensation is eliminated, humidity and temperature balanced and predictable. Operation of the building is mostly through ventilation, and the design does the rest. It's like setting the sails on a heavy-keel sailing boat, though much easier. Often a few simple chores set the building for a day, for a night, or for a season. The importance and extent of sealing is also related to climate and design intent. Sealing is yet less useful in massive buildings using natural conditioning and in buildings that rely on constant natural ventilation. Air tightness introduces a number of health and safety concerns, so that mechanical ventilation becomes necessary. Relying on sealing and insulation for energy efficiency in effectively lightweight buildings leads to overheating and dependence on air conditioning and mechanical ventilation. The science of adaptive comfort applies to naturally ventilated buildings only. The comfort expected by occupants in these buildings is related to climate and prevailing external conditions, and acknowledges that occupants can manage their own comfort with clothing. The comfort cloud best describes this broad range. In homes, the range can be greater than in offices because occupants have wardrobes and bedding on hand, and at least 1/3 of occupied time is sleeping hours. Homes should always provide safe conditions, a thermal refuge within safe temperature conditions of 12 to 30 degrees Celsius always. Healthy indoor air quality is assured through natural ventilation. Well-designed buildings should be climate change resilient, maintaining comfort, health and safety in likely weather events, natural disasters without power into the future, given our generally warming climates. Renewable technologies like passive low energy earth architecture keeps embodied and operational energy as low as possible. Ceiling fans, mass-linked natural ventilation, evaporative coolers, solar space heating, cooling, and solar hot water systems keep operational energy as low as possible. The use of renewable fuels in stoves, space heaters, and hot water services reduces both energy and carbon, keeping operational energy, keeping heating energy as low as possible. This reduces the load on the grid, makes the transition to renewables easier, and provides options in outages. A PV array is then able to repay all the operational and embodied energies. Strategy of passive low energy earth architecture is to reduce energy and carbon at every stage, so the addition of a moderately sized PV array achieves full life cycle zero carbon. My 28-year-old mud brick home is an older example of passive low energy earth architecture. It relies on simple passive solar design for cooling and heating. The heating is supplemented in winter by a solar space heater and wood heater. It is naturally ventilated and has 4.5 kilowatt hour PVs and solar hot water system fitted. Earth from the site, timber products and recycled materials like the fired bricks and brick pavers help reduce embodied energy. Newer earth homes obviously perform better, though it's surprising how well this old home performs if judged by adaptive comfort, indoor air quality, health and safety, real cost of operation, as built operational performance, and of course, life cycle design performance. This graph of modelling in NatHER's free running mode shows how the building relies on its design response to a climate file to achieve the comfort outcome. This is the most useful part of the tool for us, I think. I believe summer performance is actually better than predicted due to the limited ventilation logic used. Winter performance is about right. I appreciate the benefit of predicting and realise winter performance could be improved with today's roof insulation with optimised windows and other minor changes, and I'll be improving the design over time. However, this building offers reasonable comfort in line with adaptive comfort expectations for most of the year, and it achieves our desired comfort without carbon, so it achieves the overarching objective. The red lines I've added mark upper and lower safe limits. It achieves this. I've never recorded above 28 degrees in a heat wave without cooling, and then only on the last day. So I know summer performance is slightly better in reality than what is predicted. The home obviously doesn't need air conditioning, and it provides a thermal refuge in a heat wave or cold snap, and modelling shows it is climate change resilient as well. These are the results generated in NatHER's regulation mode, which is used to determine predicted energy usage and thermal shell efficiency. The figure in the red circle also confirms that the building wouldn't be dependent on air conditioning. Now that is a massive unrecognised advantage. It equates to safe thermal refuge in outages, no peak load on the grid, and ensures affordable operation. The heating load would be reduced by more than half if it were a new build with better ceiling and insulation and rated, say, 5 stars. Interestingly, modelling indicates that the predicted heating load diminishes over time to 0 due to climate change, though cooling is still acceptably low. This energy summary shows the building utilises a mix of electricity, carbon neutral and low carbon intensive energy, and solar generation. Total operational cost for this 225 square metre home of 3 people is less than $1,000 per annum, which is a fraction of the Australian average. We have all the usual conveniences found in Australian homes, though no need for air conditioner or mechanical ventilation, which keeps energy and costs down. During the winter, we use biomass in addition to design and solar space heater to achieve 17 to 20 degrees Celsius in living areas, and we accept 2 to 3 degrees less when sleeping snugly under a doona. Perhaps surrounding radiant heat and stillness allows comfort at a lower winter temperature. Autumn and spring are perfect. In summer, the inside temperatures rarely exceed 24 degrees C and generally sits around 20 to 23 degrees C. In 2020-21, we imported an average of 3.8 kilowatt hours to the day from the grid during the night, and utilised another 2.5 kilowatt hours from PVs by day. After returning imports, there was a net positive contribution of 1,669 kilowatt hours to the grid, which balances the use of gas for cooking and helps pay back the embodied energy. The actual performance in Neighbours couldn't be better. 6 out of 6 stars, or a leading energy performer. And Neighbours reports in carbon, which is the thing that needs addressing. These colourful columns represent the total operational and embodied energies used in our homes. Only full life cycle design looks at all this and with the correct metric. The starting point was the average home around 2003 on the left column. For 18 years, the focus has been on the red bit, thermal comfort at the tip of the columns. In theory, 6 stars is aimed at reducing this total energy by perhaps 10%. Moving from 6 to 7 stars, thermal efficiency is designed to achieve another 1.5 percentage points. Though how does this impact other energies? Improved energy efficiency of equipment and appliances, lights, etc. all help, though homes are becoming more highly specified, often for energy efficiency, with double and even triple glazing, more insulation, ceiling, air conditioning, and perhaps mechanical ventilation, and complicated wall assemblies. Potentially up goes operational and embodied energies. This is the carbon burp that concerns me. It requires oversight. I know from e-tool assessments that embodied energy has been on the rise in the earth homes I build. Also consider the unpredicted rise in cooling demand discovered in newer, thermally lightweight, highest star rated buildings. If we increase embodied energy and operational energy by 10, 20, 40%, attempting a 1 to 2% improvement to thermal efficiency, that is obviously counterproductive. I know France, UK and New Zealand are looking at introducing embodied energy to regulations this year. We need to be looking at the big picture and keep an eye on the main game, that is reducing carbon. Around 2050, we need to shrink and then wipe the entire colourful column to the point where it is on the right-hand side. The most right column, zero carbon, light blue. Now look at the passive low energy earth architecture approach, 13% beyond zero carbon full life cycle design. Thermal shell efficiency isn't the only or the best sustainable practice. Passive low energy earth architecture deserves an express pass to compliance, or at the very least an appropriate assessment criteria based on other metrics that I've mentioned. This is the E-Tool Global Emissions Certificate for my home. Designed embodied carbon is down by 41% on the base building. It is well down and certainly not up. Operational carbon is down an impressive 152%, so minimising operational energy and carbon, and with the simple addition of what is a moderately sized PV and solar hot water system. Excess electricity exported to the grid is what achieves 113% zero carbon. We have conducted several life cycle design assessments on old mud brick homes, and every one of them evaluated can achieve this or close to this with simple, affordable renewables if grid connected. This is a mud brick home I completed recently. It was rated 5.4 stars as assessed by Mike Pertell, though it would struggle with achieving the new 7-star performance being introduced. I suspect E-Tool life cycle design rating would be good, though embodied energy would be up a little. It hasn't been done yet. I expect this mud brick home to last 100 years. Buildings need to last 50 to 100 years, as they used to. The average is 25 years, and this we can't keep sending buildings to landfill every 25 years, and that's the reality with new buildings that are full of toxic waste, too difficult to recycle or economical to separate. Mike modelled this to understand what impact climate change may have on its performance. Let's have a look at that now. CSIRO climate analogue towns allow us to look at climate change predictions into the future, climate predictions in the future. My climate near Jervis Bay will be like these climates in 2030, according to CSIRO's predictions. There's a general warming, though the same coastal climate moving northwards. You can see the dots on the coastline. So Kiama, Wollongong, Sydney, Newcastle, the climates it'll be like. And these are the towns that my climate will resemble in 2050. On the map, you'll see the grey dots indicating how my climate will shift northwards again, further up towards Queensland, Sydney, Newcastle, all the way up to Port Macquarie, Taree, Yamba. And in 2090, my home may be experiencing a Queensland coastal climate, anything from Kempsey up to Hervey Bay. This graph indicates an indication of the climate change resilient of the new 5.4-star home. Predictive heating load, the orange line, decreases steadily from 75 megajoules at Tomarong, where it is now, today quickly dipping below what I think is the passive house criteria maximum heating energy demand of 54 megajoules in around 10 years. It continues to fall as the south coast climate resembles climates further north up the coast to zero heating by around 2080 with Queensland climates. Cooling load increases gradually from a low 20.3 megajoules through north coast New South Wales to southern Queensland, where the design is ideal for climate, through to Hervey Bay above Brisbane, where it rises just above passive house classic criteria, cooling energy demand allowance of 54 megajoules for the first time around 2090. At this point in the distant future, the owner could easily introduce some tropical design principles. Performance and star ratings actually improve with climate change, as you can see. And I believe the opposite will be true for effectively lightweight, well-sealed buildings. This is a different way of looking at it. At present, the heating load are more than passive house criteria, though the cooling load is much lower. The building is able to perform without air conditioning and without heating in the future, with minor alterations in 70 years' time. That's a good result, I think. Modern passive low energy earth architecture. This is a healthy, safe, comfortable, desirable and sustainable home. It goes close to maintaining adaptive comfort through design alone. In terms of top-end specification, it's affordable, naturally ventilated, excellent indoor air quality, COVID safe, suited to Australian climates, lifestyles and climates with relaxed indoor-outdoor living. This award winner in China is the sustainable future I see. Elegantly simple, passive, low energy earth architecture, healthy, safe, adaptive, comfort, low energy, low carbon, potential for zero carbon, full life cycle design, all achievable. This is how earth building could be revitalised in China and elsewhere to create a new sustainable vernacular utilising one world's resources. Inside, and it's comfortable, durable and full of light. How beautifully simple is this passive low energy rammed earth home. The surrounding built-up towns, villages and farms in the countryside here in France, within sight of the snow-covered Alps, is covered with these beautiful 18th century vernacular Pisé rammed earth buildings up to 4 stories. The architect who owns it believes it's elegantly simple, comfortable and sufficient. And I'm inclined to agree. With renewables, this passive low energy earth architecture would be beyond zero carbon full life cycle design. This is a low cost, disaster resistant earth home I developed and built in a tropical climate in the Philippines. And I stayed in that in hot, steamy conditions. A pedestal fan does the job of cooling. So how Australia best secures a sustainable built environment requires some serious contemplation and investment in research. We could do well to retrace our steps, learning from the wisdom found in vernacular architecture, rather than continuing to put all our faith in techno-optimism. Only sophisticated modelling and suitable metrics and expectations can be utilised in the design of elegantly simple, low energy, low carbon solutions. Australia needs a multidisciplinary approach to developing sustainable building solutions. It needs to include architects, engineers, building biologists, builders, and ecological auditors. We need to remember that carbon is the final arbiter, and beware the carbon burp. Never judge things how they appear on paper. It's all about performance, outcomes, and best meeting objectives. Thank you.
So just introducing the Australian Passive House Association. We're an independent non-for-profit group which aims to lead educating and promoting the certified passive house model in Australia. What we'd like to sort of achieve overall is for everyone to live and work in healthy, low energy, resilient buildings. And everything that everybody's actually talked about to now is made up of all of that as well. So the Australian Passive House Association is made up of a small number of employees presently, and they're growing, as are our volunteers and members and our board of directors, which doesn't grow, but that's what I am part of presently. So you can contact AFA through a whole range of different methods if you want to get in touch with us. Oh, wow. Okay, a little bit about me. I'm a registered architect in New South Wales and Queensland. I have been doing some education through Sydney University and New South Wales TAFE, and I also run my own architecture practice. So a little bit about Passive House now. So we do have the 5 main principles of Passive House, which I will talk about in detail and sort of introduce you to, hopefully in a slightly different format than what we've actually had already. But it's really about having energy efficient, comfortable, affordable and ecological all at the same time type of buildings. So we're not just talking about homes, we're talking about all structures that we actually live and work in. So that's what we're trying to sort of get to. But look, housing is a great place to start, because working from home at the moment, I was very tempted to put my puffer jacket on to actually present because I was a bit chilly earlier, but coming up to the presentation, I've warmed up a little. Okay, so going into why we actually have some of these things, we have Australian standards. So Jessie covered a little bit earlier about how what building codes do, and our building code references an awful lot of our Australian standards, and part of that is about how we don't actually have a rule for thermal comfort in there. So in New South Wales, we are regulated and we have basics, so we have to meet those requirements, and there's other requirements that we have to meet there. We have a thermal standard that we could apply, which is ASHRAE 55, and how the PHPP sort of joins in with that. We've actually been verified against the ASHRAE 140, which means that we can actually use that as energy software under various different types of regulatory systems around the world, which is great. So it applies everywhere. So coming back to what Passive House sort of utilizes, and I want to just get everyone to sort of think about, 6 months ago when it was a little bit warmer, we were at the beach. So this is just a nice slide of Bondi. And strangely enough, humans have this ability to adapt and put on a pair of swimmers, go to the beach and feel comfortable, get into the water to cool down. That works. That's summer. That's great. Coming into winter, try and get the slides to move. We start adapting. Next slide. And we start putting on warmer clothes. We do this naturally. We change, we adapt. Strangely sort of reminds me of the presentation of the video that Jessie ran. And well, yeah, we can easily adapt. We can put on whatever we like to keep warm. We need to actually think about our building structures rather than being intense and things that are well ventilated all the time. So if we didn't, if we wore one of these outfits to the beach in summer, I can imagine you're now thinking not comfortable, and it would actually be quite sweaty. All right, not a good thing, not very pleasant either to experience, but you would maintain some sort of temperature on the inside. And Passive House actually looks at having good thermal insulation. So the criteria I've actually put on the slides here so that you can actually read through it. I'm not going to read verbatim because I'm pretty sure you all can do that. But what I do want to point out is that in that image there on the left-hand side, you can actually pick which building has been retrofitted out of the row of housing there through the thermal imaging. And it's quite often a slide used in training and what have you. So the one that's insulated is the one that's blue. You can see all the heat coming out of the one on the left, and the other ones where you can actually see the various different types of insulation sort of qualities on that. So being aware of how your building's performing on the outside can actually be seen. So you might think back when you've been out in the mornings now, you might be able to see the neighbour's new renovation. You pop out and you can see all the stud work where it's sort of got a nice little layer of moisture on the outside of the building, and there'll be some warm sections that may not have that same sort of level of moisture on it. The PHPP, which people in Passive House refer to, calculates the, oops, I'll just go back one more. It calculates, well, you have to input the information. It does actually look at all the R values and U values. So we actually look at how that works for the building. So we have to understand what's actually going into a building. So we're designing for climate, which is super important. And each climate obviously will need slightly different thicknesses of insulation and things like that. But then when we look at our buildings, and if you take a really good hard look, even in the room that you might be in right now, what is the thinnest part of your wall system right now? And I dare say it's probably the windows. They may look quite generic, like most timber windows or aluminium windows, steel windows even. You might be in an office block if you're not working from home, which probably a lot of us are right now. You might be looking at a curtain wall facade. You may have woken up in your house this morning, given it's winter, and you may have found that you've got some condensation on your windows. So just down here on the left, a lot of people are experiencing this at the moment. And that is actually rather common. Okay, so to prevent that, we need to stop using buildings. Okay, but we have those so that we are comfortable and we're trying to live in more healthy environments. I do remember myself growing up and doing what this young lad's doing here on the right and writing on the windows, and my mum would get so annoyed because then you'd have that there for the rest of the day, whatever you'd scribbled on the windows, which is kind of a nice sort of thing. But, you know, even brand new windows can have moisture come in. Like if you've got double glazing, perhaps in this scenario here, you might actually have moisture coming in through the frame rather than actually through the glass. So a new retrofit scenario may actually also have its problems. So you do have to be aware of what sort of things you're doing to your building. So talking to people in the industry and understanding what's actually happening. Windows are great. We've always designed, well, as an architect, we've designed windows to capture views, open. Yes, we can open windows to give it light, because daylight's actually really good for our health and well-being, which is really important. If you're lucky enough to have views of a garden or things like that, so bringing that sort of natural environment in, so that's part of the things that we like in Australia, is to be able to open the doors and windows. And you can do that in Passive House, okay? There are no rules to sort of having an airtight building, otherwise we'll be living like this all the time. So capturing out of views, you can have lots of shading on windows if you're facing, you know, an inappropriate sort of sun angle, that type of thing. And when you actually go in and have a consultation with a Passive House consultant, they will actually input all of your windows, same as what an energy assessor would do, into the PHPP. And you put all your shading, your frames, the entire window system, and how it's installed in the wall is actually calculated to become more energy efficient. So that is actually really important, that all of those things are looked at. So the different orientations of your building, north, south, east, west, all of those things are taken into account, which they should be. Okay, for me, that is what I would deem a normal thing. But some people just don't see that. I have actually seen differences in using just the basic system of a horizontal versus a vertical window of the same issue being problematic because of the orientation of facing due west. So all of those things can actually have their own sort of impacts. So what does Passive House actually require? So Passive House requires thermally broken windows, so we're not having an energy transfer through the frame. So what we don't want is heat flowing through our frame. So we actually have a thermal break, and you can actually see the different types of construction in this in these frames. So we've got the three primary different types of frames that you can have. You've got your aluminium, you've got timber, and then we've got a composite. You can actually get UPVC as well. So they're quite common in the industry, and they all come thermally broken. Double glazing, quite common for Passive House. And the rumours are is that sometimes to get triple glazing, you might find that that cost competitiveness is very similar to double glazing right now because of way they've actually set up some of the things and where people are actually gaining those windows from. So looking at how it's installed in the window, in the wall system is actually important as well. So quite often people will say the window has to be installed in the insulation layer. Okay, so they're talking the big cool climates. But here in Australia, our wall systems are much thinner. So we actually have to look at how all of that works together. So being aware of how those things work together is actually super important.
Kylie, it's just Anthony here. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know we've got about 4 minutes left for your presentation time. If we're
keep going.
Our last presenter.
All right, no problem. Okay, so what we've got here is an example of what the weather will be expecting in Sydney on Saturday. We have some winds coming up, light, possible rain. So that means, you know, the sunlight's not going to be around. So that has an impact on how one might actually use their building. So that's problematic. Try and fly through it really quick. We're going to rely on possibly human behaviour to open windows. Not usually a good thing. But if the wind stops, and I'm just going to see whether this will work here. Yeah, if there is no wind, how do you get that air to follow through in the building? it's notorious for not following, the directions that we've drawn on the plans. Particularly if there's no wind outside, you open the windows, there's not going to be any wind inside either. Those things are really important to understand, that, and to rely on human behaviour. Are we going to actually make sure that everyone is going to open those windows when they're supposed to ventilate their buildings? Not necessary. If we're going to build passive house, we're going to ventilate it correctly. So you may have any combination of any of these elements here. So you could have an MVHR, you could open your windows. You may have a heating system that may range from having a heated towel rail, using a hairdryer, possibly a small heater, small kilowatts, okay? A very small cooling system depending on climate, and depending on climate again, dehumidification. Must ventilate, okay? So it doesn't matter how any of those methods are actually applied, really important that that's actually done. So what's actually on this slide here is the insides of an MVHR unit and how the air actually exchanges. You've got your heat and cool passing each other. So intake air passing the exhaust air, and that heat is being transferred, and the constant temperature is actually being maintained inside of the building. The different installs, the different types of ductwork through there. All right, so living in a passive house doesn't mean it's going to be airtight. Okay, it's not an esky. They're really good for keeping your food cool. There are lots, strangely enough, lots and lots of videos and information guides on how to actually use a cool box, which I found was really interesting. So cool it first, put your food in, ice, cooled food, otherwise it's just not going to be effective. And some of these cool boxes actually work really well for 3 or 4 days, depending on how often they're opened. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we've got our thermography differences. So currently in our Australian stock, we probably have a bathroom exhaust fan. That's what it might look like in summertime. And the power point's the same. We might have heat and cool coming through the wall system if we're not insulated well. And taken a couple of years ago, I had a client send me a thermography image of her lovely Beaufort doors in her living room at the stage, and you could see the cool coming in. So, and it tells us that it was 16.5 degrees coming in through the door, which was interesting there. So testing that air tightness test through design is actually important. So the red line test, which is an example on the left, so not only in plan does that get tested, the detailing of how that gets built has to be done in section, and any detailed joints actually have to be thought about. And then all of that gets verified on how well the building is actually sealed through an air tightness test. And the requirements for passive house are quite specific, and all of those final details are important, that you're not just chasing one element, you're chasing a group of elements together to create a certified passive house. So the final test will give you at least 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. So that's important. So an air blower door test. So that was the red door image there. And then we'll get onto thermal bridging. Currently, so some thermography for you on the top left here, we can see this was my client's house again. She took a picture of her kitchen and she just made herself a cup of tea. So you can see the cup of tea here. She'd used the toaster and the kettle. So they're all the hot elements. You can see it's still cold outside, and you can see, energy flowing through the building, as you can do here. So this is an image you can find on the internet as well. And this is a balcony coming out of a building. So a lot of 3-story walk-ups that you'll see around, particularly Sydney and any other built-up area really, will actually be like this. So being aware of how the energy is flowing through your buildings. What do you ask for when you actually want a good, healthy building? You don't want mold forming in corners. You don't want things going wrong. And that's what we're trying to design out here, and a minimization of risk corners. So where we see intersections of walls and roofs, where it's not well insulated, you might actually find that causes mold on the inside of the house, and that's bad for your health. So we are actually really aware of that, and they're all the things that need to be modelled and designed and built accordingly. Okay, so everything gets verified on the way. So identifying any thermal bridges, so any intersections of the building that may actually have an impact, need to be designed out. And as a result, you can have a building that looks like any shape, size, design. There's no particular look for a passive house. Reducing thermal bridges is really important, and you can introduce other tool standards if you wanted to. You could build a larger building in conjunction with the WELL standard, the Living Building Challenge. You can apply other things to it. You don't just have to stick with the one. But I think passive house is a good start to actually reduce the energy consumption in bringing everything together there. The main criteria is about energy reduction. And to do that, you keep your building system, which is your building envelope, so your walls, your roof, your floor, you're keeping those in sound condition for the longevity of the building, so it's more sustainable. We're not going to be knocking down these buildings really quickly. They're not going to rot. They're not going to cause mold. We can maintain them and look after them for the long term. Okay, so that's the main criteria there. And just to sort of point out, Peter was talking about passive housing in terms of classic. So there we've got the energy criteria of what the classic needs to achieve, and then we've got another level up from that, which is the plus, and then the premium. So it's all about consumption and what you're putting back into the environment and using. And as a result, you can actually be certified with any of those criteria, and you can retrofit, which is actually super important as well. So rather than knocking down old building stock, you can actually improve it. And that's something that I'm embarking myself at the moment to go down that sort of avenue with a few buildings. And then sometimes when people test, they don't necessarily achieve the 0.6 ACH, or they might have some thermal bridging that didn't quite work in construction. Something may have gone just slightly array. They may achieve a low energy building rating, which is, you know, that's still being a certified passive house. So you've got those ratings there. Why would you do it? Energy costs are increasing. We do want to actually be aware of climate change, and that has an impact on everybody. So as things start changing, and passive house is actually a good thing. Okay, we can apply all of this to meet requirements before the government even tells us to. And there's a number of people out in this lovely country already doing that. So sustainable goals, how many of those you want to take on is how you apply it. And we've just got a lovely little circle there that enables us to sort of go through and check through all those sustainable goals that one can actually achieve. This is readily available also on the internet as well. That is the end of my talk. Hopefully that's been helpful for you. And if you do want to know more and check out some case studies, check out the QR code, and you can do a free download for passive house buildings in Australia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kylie. I'll just ask you to stop sharing your screen. It's hover up the top and stop. And I'm going to switch now to Phil Harris's presentation, which is a video. Phil is a principal architect at Troppo Architects, and I'll let his video speak for itself. It goes for 15 minutes, so we are going to go over time. If our speakers are able to stay around, I would love it if they could try and answer a couple of questions, but we might try and answer most of the questions offline after this meeting. We might just pick out a couple of key questions after Phil's video. I will just share that video now and we will get started.
Happy Thursday, all. So you know where I come from. This is the kind of architecture that has inspired me, and that I've become used to making too. It's also a kind of architecture that has difficulty getting approved today, especially anywhere north of Sydney. And that's over half of our island. But also, it has difficulty getting approved down south. To the topic. Well, what arrogance? Ventilate, right. Right for who? What anonymous who? Right for what particular day or evening? Of what particular moment along the string of the daily vacillations of sun, shadow, breeze and katabatic drafts? This right is of course a right determined by the building code's formulaic approach to energy efficiency. That is, this right is determined by some lowest common denominator computer modelling. Some algorithm underpinned by the autocratic assumption that an individual's sense of comfort can only be delivered by the addition of measures of mechanical heating or cooling. And for efficiency within a heavily insulated and perfectly sealable shroud, undisrupted by ventilation. Abominably, it assumes some summary picture of climate held in averages, and within that postcard shot, some mythical human with some specific average biological response to temperature and humidity, and intolerance to the joy of wind through hair and sun on a cheek. And somehow this lowest common denominator response is going to reduce our planet's greenhouse gas emissions and so save its biodiversity in the face of climate change. Let's backtrack a bit. And I'll begin my message. Back in '64, Professor Max Phelan was able to write, "A country's architecture is a near-perfect record of its history. Every building captures in physical form the climate and resources of a country's geography and the conditions of its society. Every building explains the time and place in which it was built." Well, times, they seem to have changed. The rise of an architecture of sameness has coincided with the globalisation of media and entertainment, the common availability of air conditioning. It's also coincided with increased emission of greenhouse gases through the rate of domestic and industrial consumption of electricity. North and south of the tropic, inland and on the coast, as we soak up more and more electricity, we're also becoming a single flavour country. Let's jump off the runaway train of consumption for a moment. Let's pause and reflect. Let's centre ourselves. People are naught without a planet that sustains them. And the planet is not a dumb ball of stardust. It's an intricate web of life in strange and myriad form. It has elements, earth, air, fire, water. And the planet has awesome power. It turns evenly yet unpredictably, and at times it seems to turn on us, destroying, then again, renewing, nourishing us. We can't separate our well-being from the sustaining web. Let's think about it in an Australian way. As Big Bill Nigel Kakadu Man says in his poem, Feeling. Tree smooth. What about you and me, smooth skin? Might be sunburn you, but you got white, no matter me. But this the story, you can't split him. You can't change him, you can't do anything. This story, you got to keep him in your feeling. Tree for us, eagle, anything. Eagle, bird, animal, rock, this the story. Listen carefully, careful. And this spirit he come in your feeling, and you'll feel it, anyone that, I feel it. My body same as you. I telling you this because the land for us. Never change round, never change. Places for us, earth for us, star, moon, tree, animal. No matter what sort of animal, bird or snake, all that animal same like us, our friend that. This story, you can listen carefully, and how you want to feel on your feet. This story coming through your body, you go right down foot and head, fingernail and blood, through the heart. And you can feel it because you'll come right through. And when you sleep, you might dream something. That's a call for the ongoing duration of this planet, our island as part of it. In this material world, it's hard to believe we're from the same universal tree as Big Bill's mom, from the same background as so many in the so-called less fortunate world, and even of the same blood as our forebears, for by comparison to us, how little our parents and grandparents lived with, how little so many people on this planet still live with, how little all people once lived with. Remember the magic of sleeping on back lawns on heatwave nights, the family camping trip, of riding fearlessly to school and rollicking along in the back of your dad's ute. For those younger than me, for better or for worse, maybe not. I'd argue habits of the past hold the low energy future, not the habits of now. For now, the climate, it seems, is an enemy to be tamed. We must air condition a wrap for ourselves in our homes, our workplaces, and when mobile. We cannot possibly exist without it, even if it means crashing the grid. So we air condition apace. And in order to convince ourselves that we're curating the planet, to be seen to be tackling the emission of greenhouse gases, within the building code, we've developed those energy efficiency provisions. We now have a building approval framework that is predicated on the inclusion of air conditioning. The product of these provisions, to nutshell it, is a sealed insulated box, and a rather large one at that. It's able to sprawl in footprint because the more expensive things, the traditional and fiddly things that adjust and open and shut to ameliorate climate, don't need to be there. A switch and an air conditioner is cheaper. In essence, it's a very large esky with a little operable drain hole. It has become the ultimate energy efficiency building paradigm, and it is highly consumptive of resources. Isn't this a case of the emperor's new clothes? Once upon a time, when our housing's greenhouse gas emissions were way less, every dwelling dropped and lifted blinds, opened and shut its perimeter, to work as best it could with its given climate, its seasons, and the day that was. They've served us for millennia, nurtured most of our population. They were free-running buildings. Today, there is no ready approval path for a free-running solar passive design building, an unair-conditioned building, unless it also adopts seal-it-up, insulated-to-death detailing, as well as the opening and screening that an environmentally engaging building will have to have, which of course also costs on costs. This creates concern for us at Troppo, for not everyone, our clients included, want to evaporate a budget with this sealer-up, air conditioner-up, lowest common denominator stuff. At least not at the expense of being able to afford the joyful, place-responsive, free-running componentry. As a rule, our free-running tropical buildings, built on tradition and with the lowest imaginable energy inputs, on review, in fact, receive 0 of a maximum, say, 5 stars, even when they win Sustainable Architecture Awards. Down south, to get to afford a build, we fib at approval time. And on site, in due course, switch to more pragmatic skins with more adjustable elements that enable the house to better work to enjoy the beautiful day that usually is, and keep budget intact. Why bother? Why be the young boy calling out the emperor? Why? Because the environmental and social results will be better. I'll explain. Sure, flood, drought and fire colour our impression of the difficulties of this country. And then there's storms and cyclones, epitomised most extremely by Darwin's Tracy and pre-heralded by Xavier Herbert in 1938 in Capricornia, where he said, "Here, nature looms larger than man." Yet, despite all that, our climate is not that of Mars or Venus. It's what supports us. The atmospheric cloak that enabled us to be here at all. In most parts of Australia, it's damn gorgeous 300 days a year, and a memorable, socially binding talking point for the rest. So throw away the so-called energy efficiency provisions of the building code and bring back intuitive design that is based on understanding tradition of what has worked in the past. Pay a serious penalty to add energy-consuming air conditioning, and give credit to buildings that can operate well 300 or 365 days, that operate well enough without air conditioning. As Matt Pritchard, architect elder, once told students in the Temperate South, if you're cold, put on a jumper. Perhaps in the north it's get out a beer. The free-running approach is humanly involving and intuitive. It's humble in its interdependency with nature. It's aware of inputs and outputs. It stands a good chance of reflecting place. In terms of mindfulness, it makes us contemplate shelter. Surely architecture's core purpose. Food, sex and shelter. These three things are what all creatures need and do. The great triumvirate that enables life before we get to the cafe to chat or the opera or the oval or the mountain bike track. All creatures need and spend much time in getting the food that fuels them. All creatures copulate in order to pass on their genes, and many do so to cement nurturing relationships. And no creature can get through the passage of day and night and the seasons and support its hunting and gathering or its rooting and nurturing without shelter. And what is shelter? We skip over this too much as architects, although we imagine that's where we fit in. Though of course we eat and drink and screw around a bit too. We at Troppo say architecture is not an artefact. It's not about a material thing, nor about style nor decoration. Controversially, perhaps, we think it's not much about that inert lump called a building. Shelter proffers an ideal with all creatures. We creatures don't always shelter from things. We shelter to be able to better interact with our surroundings. Think of an eagle perched adjacent its perfectly sited historic nest, awaiting the moment to dive and kill. Think of a fish parked in seagrasses, awaiting a new tide's passing nourishments. Think of a possum cooling, snoozing in a tree hollow, or perhaps your roof space, connected in a trice to its aerial network, awaiting a night's gambolling. Shelter's not just refuge, it's about being able to be projected out there, and of course being able to retreat from being out there. At its best, shelter enables us to interact with the world in winning ways, as well as to offer us a means of retreat and revival. Shelter is potentially a dynamic and an energising force in our lives, and it's potentially didactic, an educative force. Locked away, disconnected from our environment, how can we hope to be wise to all of the social opportunities around us, those chance interactions that aren't pre-selected by our digital feeds? How can we hear and smell, not just view nature? How can we begin to appreciate the intricacy of the planet's web of life that sustains us? How can we take on the role of curator for the place where we live? Can good food be from a production line chemically fabricated? In that, where's the mind food, the connection with land, season and harvest? Can good sex be simply physical, anonymous, out of a manual, or robotic? In that, where's the scope for caring richly and empathetically for others, for building love? Can good shelter be an operable sealed bubble-like box? In that, where's the scope for social interaction and growing an environmental awareness, for truly bonding and actually curating? Architecture that understands shelter as a basic dynamic in our lives will go beyond the merely tangible, a building. It will deliver a program that energises us, gives us scope to fully engage in living mindfully. Such an architecture, even if it has air conditioning, will rarely resort to its use, rarely lock itself away in a mind-numbing stasis that brings. Rather, it will extend our environmental connection, our social opportunity. It will likely reflect on place. This is an architecture that development plans and building codes should state support for, on page 1. If those things are delivered, what else comes near to importance? Let decently considered free-running dwellings be exempt from lowest common denominator, aircon presumptive, energy efficiency prescriptions. Let's breathe in this planet of ours. Young hearts, run free. Cheers.
Thank you to Phil Harris for providing that for us. We are over time now. I'm very grateful to see that my 3 non-video presenters are still with me, and I'm going to go through some quick questions. I will end this when either Lachlan, who is out there amongst you participants, tells me I should because our participants have dropped off, or when our presenters tell me they need to leave. So please speak up, folks, if you have concerns and need to get to other meetings. So I'm going to let's try and keep our answers short too, if you don't mind, so we can get through the question list and poor Lachlan doesn't have to compile written questions after this, which with a couple of hundred people in the crowd could take him a while. So the first question for Jesse, does the heat recovery ventilation system also take care of humidity control? How is mold and condensation managed in an airtight home? Sorry, Jesse, you're on mute.
Yes, the answer is yes. HRV systems are designed in that they bring in outdoor air. The outdoor air is generally drier than the indoor air. If it's a well-sealed building, that reduces the indoor humidity. It's a little bit different if you start going into the tropics, but yes, is the answer.
Great, thank you. We'll stick with the simple yes for the sake of brevity then. Thanks, Jesse. Another one for you. If a 6-star NatHERS compliant house has 10-star occupants, will it deliver a healthy and efficient home?
Is this for me?
That's for you.
Yeah.
If someone else wants to jump in.
We've got a NatHERS house with 10-star occupants.
Yep, 6-star house with 10-star occupants.
Yes, I think anything that has 10-star occupants will deliver a low energy outcome, and that also, talking to Phil's presentation, is exactly what he's designing. And I don't think he should be restricted, and his team of architects should be restricted from designing that stuff, because the people that are thinking, i.e. Phil, Kylie, Peter, they should all be able to design stuff they want, but they are niches at this point. They're all niches.
Great, thank you. We've got one for Peter next. There's a couple of questions in this vein, Peter, about how can earth building adequately respond to dense urban conditions? Examples all seem to rely on large blocks with unobstructed solar access and ventilation paths. Are there any successful examples of constricted inner urban sites? And do you see this as being a mainstream type solution at any point?
I think it could be mainstream. I don't think there's any problem with being mainstream. You have to do a lot more education, and subcontractors need a lot more subcontractors have to come on board. But there's no reason why it couldn't be. The earth and solid brick, like cavity brick, are very similar in the way they are designed, and there's plenty of solid brick buildings in Sydney and other capital cities and Wollongong and so forth. I've lived in brick buildings in Sydney and Wollongong and been very comfortable there. I can't see a problem with them. Not all of them had good solar access. Some of them had poor solar access or incorrect orientation. They were still quite comfortable.
Great, thanks. And that's actually a reasonable segue to a personal question about your house. How cold does it get in winter? How much are you relying on your ability to tolerate extremes of temperature?
Well, you picked a very cold week. Last week, I was lighting the fire at night and letting it go out. This week, it's been like 3 degrees overnight and 14, 15 during the day, which is not ideal. So I've had to light the fire and keep it going a bit during the day as well. But my trigger point for lighting a fire is 16.5 degrees, 17 degrees. I'm quite comfortable. I don't know whether that's just me or whether it's the fact that I'm surrounded by mass and still air. I don't know, but that's my trigger point. So it gives me quite comfortable.
Great, thanks, Peter. Kylie, I'll open this one to you because I haven't given you a question yet, but this could equally well be answered by others, and others may want to venture an opinion. if we assume a +3 degree world, which is a pretty scary assumption, does that change anything about whether passive house or passive solar is the appropriate way to go in Australia?
Oh, good question. Personally, and also I do know that you can future test the modelling in passive house, which is great. You can actually, I think it's they go to the 2030 model, and you can actually future test it or to see whether or not it will cope with a 1.5 or a 3 degree increase, and still see whether or not your design for your fabric works. So it is possible that you can still do that.
Great. Did anyone else want to offer an opinion?
Well, I've just done that. I don't know whether the slide was there long enough for people to see, but we looked at climate resilience out until 2090 using CSIRO climate analogues and swapping the postcodes into the NatEarth engine, and it was working. Mudbrick actually improved performance until it got to the Queensland border. And then because all the heating loads disappeared completely, which they did into Queensland too, but the cooling load slightly rises, but we're able to counter that in 2009. You could do things to the house to make it a better tropical design.
Yeah, so I'll add to that. I think the issue is, yeah, if you go down the path of do you have an air conditioner or do you not, when it does get to 45 degrees outside, as it has in many parts of Australia or even warmer, it's not going to help you. A breeze is not going to help you. So the best thing you can do is lock up your house, keep the cool air in your house, and try not to die. So basically, yeah, those extremes is when a highly insulated envelope helps you. And when it's Goldilocks conditions outside, i.e. nice and comfortable, you can open up any house and live indoor, outdoor, al fresco lifestyle. And that is, you know, temperature between 20 to 26 degrees. Any house can open up.
Thanks,
I'd like to return bout in a heat wave. I've got 200 tons of thermal mass here in a heat wave, like with over 40 degree temperatures. The maximum I've ever recorded in this house is 28 degrees.
Yeah.
And that is on the last day of a heat wave. It gradually will go from 20 up to 22, 23, 24, and then right at the end of the heat wave, get up to 28.
Yeah. And that makes sense. It's like I was trying to talk about in my presentation, which is a lot of thermal mass, which was traditionally done before we had air conditioning, keeps your building cool. But the question then is, what's it like in winter?
Well, it is winter now. This is the coldest part of winter for me.
Yeah, so you got to light the fire and keep it warm.
I've got a fire, yeah.
I'll leave that question here in favour of one that I think is a fantastic question and have an opinion on myself. But does it have to be a choice? Can we have both? Can we have a house that's capable of running free running and passive house? And is that necessarily more expensive than either of the options on their own?
Oh, I've got an opinion on that straight away. Now, as Australians, we have the second highest or largest size homes in the world. If we downsize that, we have totally affordable housing. We have to put that in perspective. Yes, it is. It can be definitely affordable.
And it's possible to have a passive house and passive solar house?
It would depend on how you use your thermal mass, whether or not you're earth coupling the slab to the ground. There's all sorts of different things that you can take into account. Yes, it's possible. It just depends on how and what climate.
I just think it's you sort of go one way or the other. I think if you're going to spend all the money on sealing up airtight and putting in a mechanical ventilation machine, which is $14,000 or something to buy, and you're really stuck with that path, you don't want to waste all that money and then start opening up your windows and enjoying the climate. I think you're sort of making that decision when you set your house. This one
People do that all the time with normal air conditioning systems. They go and spend 20 grand on a ducted heating and cooling system and still open their windows and doors. So the argument's not really valid.
Not me.
So I think I agree with Peter in some respects, because I think what Phil Harris is doing, if you make the decision right up front, am I going for a pure solar passive design and I'm going to not have air conditioning, then you design it that way. Otherwise, you go the other way to design the building to make sure that you can efficiently contain the warm or cool air in your building. But in saying that, it doesn't mean you can't open up the bifolds and have an alfresco barbecue. You don't have to use that. And if you count the number of hours in the year that you're actually entertaining your friends on the deck, it's not 8,760 hours a year. You're lucky to get 20 hours a year.
Cool, thank you. I've got another one where I'm paraphrasing a few people as well, but we've got a growing population in Australia. We've got growing consumption issues. We've got climate change issues. Can we ever get either of these approaches adequately applied to mass housing of the type we see in the suburbs at the cost we're currently delivering that housing?
Yep.
I'll hand over to you, Jesse, because you were nodding most vehemently to begin with.
Yeah, that's what my presentation was about. I was pointing to the mainstream market. That's what the regulations are for. As Phil correctly pointed out, the lowest common denominator. They're the people that are going to try and build the cheapest house and sell it for the most possible money. So in my opinion, the methodology that Passive House is employing, there's a lot of learnings from that, and some of the systems and technologies out of that can be deployed in the mainstream market to get a better outcome than we're currently getting in that mainstream market. But that means we can't pretend that we're building these hybrid solar passive design houses and everyone's 10-star occupants, because I think we've got somewhere like 500, 600 people on the call. That's probably everyone in the country that actually is likely to be a 10-star occupant.
Oh, Jesse, I hope there's a few more out there that couldn't make it. And we're down to about 250 at this point of
Okay.
presentation. Did anyone else want to venture an opinion on
that? The whole of Western Australia used to be mass building, like the double brick, cavity brick construction. It is the mainstream over there, and I think it's a shame it's not the mainstream in other places in Australia. It's sort of I don't know why, but everyone's sort of on the East Coast has gone with lightweight building, probably cost issues, I'm not sure, but over there it's cheaper to build double brick. So the embodied energy in bricks a bit higher, but it lasts a long time. But it could be substituted for earth. Rammed earth could be a good substitute. So they're all built in suburbia, so there's no reason why you couldn't build those houses on earth in suburbia in Sydney, or they used to be all mass buildings in Sydney.
Thanks, Peter. Kylie, did you have anything to add? Or Jesse, before we get back to you, Jesse.
I've now got my fingerless gloves on because I am sitting in my double brick home that is freezing. So, look, I'll open the windows and doors just to get fresh air in the house during winter for an hour max. But, really, there's better ways of building. Brick veneer is actually thermally better performing than double brick.
Are you on a slab or you're timber floor?
Both. I've got both.
Yeah. I think it's probably better on a slab.
So we insulated under that.
Jesse, I'll let you close out before we enter into a debate.
So what I was going to say is the passive house system doesn't exclude rammed earth, mud brick, straw bale, anything. It's quite contrary to that. It actually is great if you use those eco building technologies. And Clima was born out of the eco building movement in Germany. And in the eco construction industry, you use natural materials, wood fiber insulation, timber, cellulose fiber. All those materials, one of the fundamental problems is if they get wet or damp for too long, they start to go moldy and eventually rot. And that's why ProClima exists, to manage the water and moisture in the building structure. Whether that's a passive house or whether it's just a stock standard build, it doesn't matter. But the point is, the rammed earth, the mud brick side is where we came from. that's our bones.
Thanks, Jesse. Kylie, I've got a couple of questions for you. I'll roll a couple of slightly dissimilar questions into one and say, could you provide some comment on evidence around how passive house performs in the wet tropics? And on top of that, how do you feel about Jesse's claim that passive house is independent from orientation?
Ooh, the claim I would pretty much agree with, because I've had a number of situations where designing out issues, you can design completely passive solar, which I was doing. And then I moved to suburbia in Sydney, where quite built up, and then my clients were similar situations. There is nothing stopping those breezes from being changed from your neighbours building a 2-story building next to you. There's nothing about other buildings and structures, and I've got a massive hospital being built up near me at the moment, and that's changing how the air moves. And if I didn't have this double brick house, I would want a passive house. I still want a passive house, because then I wouldn't have to worry about the orientation. I could still get sunlight in, but I can use it to my advantage rather than sort of, it's about feeling comfortable and well-being, that healthy mindset and things like that, rather than sort of just looking at all of that. And also then you've got privacy issues in suburbs. And the other part of your question, now I've got to go back to it, the beginning part. The tropics. Look, as far as worldwide, there are a number of buildings that have been built in the tropics. So there is a factory in Sri Lanka that's been built to passive house standard. Works perfectly. There's one in Dubai, there's some in Mexico, there's some in Spain, and there's a variety happening around the world. So it is, whilst it's been born out of the cooler climate, it is actually becoming more popular in the warmer climate because there's advantages of using it in both places. Like it's just makes perfect sense. It's building science.
Great, thank you. I might end the questions there. We're coming up on 2:30, which is half an hour longer than we meant to go. Thank you for hanging around, speakers. I really do appreciate you sharing your expertise with our audience. We got quite a lot of questions, some of which are a bit technical. I've tried to roll them up as much as I can. If anyone's got specific questions, I know some of the technical questions will be answered in the document Kylie linked to in her presentation. And there's other resources linked in our presenters' presentations. We will make all of this available with our presenters' permission after the webinar, but please give us a little bit of time. As we work for government, we are required not to release them until we've done all of the transcripts and so on for accessibility purposes. So you have to wait while we have transcripts typed of what has been a very long and interesting presentation. I apologise in particular for those of you that are keen to get hold of Peter's slides. I know there were a lot of people that didn't quite follow some of those slides as we were lurching about a little bit, but we will get them to you as early as we possibly can. Thanks very much to my support crew, Lachlan and Eric out there. Thanks, presenters, and we will be in touch about the next webinar as soon as we have it organised. Thanks, everyone.